our next speaker is a director of photography, does amazing work, and is really going to blow you away with his presentation. Ladies and gentlemen, Ian Murray!
Right, hello everyone. So I've been working in the sort of traditional film industry now for about 25 years. I graduated from film school in 1995 in London, the London College of Printing at the time. And I was told when I was first at film school, actually my first week at film school, I'd struggled to get in. I wasn't very academic at school. So it was, for me, it was an incredible triumph just getting into film school. And I remember the first seminar we had was telling us how we'd probably never work in the film industry. So it was a little bit, disappointing, to say the least. And I sort of decided then, I knew then I had a big advantage because I knew I wanted to be a cinematographer. At the time, most people thought films were made by directors and they didn't realize it was like a collective, collaborative effort. So all of my fellow students all wanted to be directors. And I announced quite early on that I was going to be a cinematographer, which put me into quite a strong position. I got to choose the best projects to work on. So as I say, I graduated in 1995, and I was very nervous about the fact there wasn't a lot of work around. So I decided at that point that I'd specialize in short form. Now, at the time, there was only 5 television channels. There weren't many cinematographers, or the English term is director of photography. So there weren't actually that many of us working in London. So I managed to get shooting actually relatively quickly. Now, I was the first generation of like film school grads that started working on film sets without going down the traditional route. Now, at the time, the film sets were still kind of governed by the traditional kind of hierarchy, which would be like you start off as a camera trainee for maybe a couple of years, and then you get promoted to what's called a clapper loader, which is where you do the clapperboard and you load a film up, which is an incredibly responsible job to have. Because if you expose a film by mistake, then you probably never work again, right? And then you eventually move on to being a focus puller, and then you become an operator, and then maybe after sort of 10 years, 15 years, you get to light. You get to become a director of photography. Now, I was basically a 25-year-old with a huge amount of passion to work with lights, and I started off in the camera department as a really quite bad trainee, and then an even worse clapper loader. I exposed a roll of film on my first week working as a clapper loader, and the whole of the set had to do another reshoot for a day, and I felt like the smallest I've ever felt in my life. And then I was a horrible focus puller. I was really bad at that, and I realized that I'd better start announcing to the industry that I was going to be a director of photography, or there'd be no career left for me. So that's what I did. I started very, very quite young. And as I say, I was a film school grad, and I didn't really understand the way it worked properly. So my first slide is something I'm going to refer back to later. This is a thing called set notes. So as I say, I'm from the traditional filmmaking background. I'm not a YouTuber, and I've just recently set up an Instagram account. It's only a few months old. And what I've been doing is I've been breaking down what happens on sort of more professional film sets, so people can learn particularly about lighting, because as I'll come on to, I believe that lighting is the black arts of cinematography. It's the most important aspect to learn, and it's the one that takes the longest time to learn as well. So anyway, I thought we'd start with a video of something. Since we're in Ireland, let's look at a video of Guinness that I shot many years ago. So guys, if you could play that, please.
Where I'm from, there are 2 kinds of men. Us and them. We only have one thing in common. And every year, we do battle. But this year, an extreme extraordinary thing happened. As it turns out, we have two things in common. Now that's greatness. But then, there's a drop of greatness in every man.
Yeah, thanks. That's an example of quite a traditional sort of commercial, really, in the sense that we shot that on film, and we shot it on a process called anamorphic, which you're probably familiar with. It's a lens system, and we had two operators on that job, and they had these sort of big film cameras with these anamorphic lenses on the front. And to give you an example, as anamorphic zoom lens, which is a 25 millimeter to 250 millimeter lens, is about that size. It's a huge lens, and they're very slow lenses as well. If you know a little bit about aperture or optics of a lens, you know that the T-stop's very important, or the f-stop. In photography, it's the f-stop. In filmmaking, we call it T-stop or transmission stop. And they work on an average of 5.6 stops. So you actually need a lot more light with anamorphic normally if you're shooting with the big zoom lenses. So even though that looks like quite a naturalistic kind of thing with not many lights, and it just looked like you could just capture that on an iPhone or a 5D or something, a little DSLR, it was these massive cameras. And we had obviously dark-skinned subject matter, so we had these massive big. What we do is we create these big frames, these big frames of white bounce material, and we have those with people holding these frames, because if the wind picks up, they can act as sails and blow away. So you can see how it builds. You start using big cameras, you start using big bounce materials and big lights to bounce into those bounce materials, and then suddenly this is a massive lumbering beast. It's loads of equipment, it's loads of manpower, and you end up with something that these days you could actually shoot very simply. If you have a camera that's very sensitive, you could shoot a lot of that with available lights. Maybe you've got like a wider range of tonal sensitivity, so you might not need as much fill light in there as we were using at the time. But this is like I say, an example of traditional cinematography. And what I'm going to try and do as I talk to you today is sort of explain to you a little bit about what the role of a director of photography or a cinematographer is, and how we sort of think about a project, what's kind of going on in our heads and how we kind of like visualize things. Because the principles that I've learned over the years still are true now. Now, the technology's changed, and the way we go about things has changed, and there's less barriers to entry, so there's a lot more competition now. When I started, as I said, it was like maybe I was on a list of 50 other DOPs working on high production commercials in London, and now I'd say there's probably about 7,000, if not more, people competing for my work, or the work that I was previously doing. And at the time, we had a captive audience. We had 5 channels, so you can imagine how the brands would work. They'd have a very big television broadcast budget for, they'd have to buy a slot on television, which would cost them a lot of money, and of course their production budget would reflect that, so you'd always have like quite big budgets to work to. So I was sort of flying around the world and shooting these quite big campaigns with a lot of equipment and a lot of crew. I'll give you an example of another one. These are some of the brands I've worked with over the years. I've specialized in food and in beauty, and do your car commercial as well. So there's quite a lot of brands that we've worked with over the years. So this one, basically, I'm going to talk, as I say, about traditional industry methods first, and then we're going to move on to how things are changing. So this is a campaign we did for the RAF, and we actually shot this on the south coast of England. So basically, we shot in this shipping container yard, and we had Chinook helicopters coming from the RAF. And if you look at these images, the thing I want to talk about is how a cinematographer sort of develops the look of something and the equipment that we use to do that. So when you first look at these images, they look quite naturalistic. So let's go back and look at them again. But one thing they all have in common is they all have relatively dark foregrounds. So, and you'll notice that with a lot of the exterior work I do, one of the things that I'm aiming to do always is to darken the foreground and to create depth. Because one of the roles of a cinematographer is to try and create depth in imagery, which is very important. So we go around as humans and the way we interpret the world is through two eyes normally, and we have a depth perception because of that. And when we represent that world on a flat screen, one of the roles of good photography or good cinematography is to try and create that depth. And one of the ways that we go about that is to create layers of brighter and darker. So you're looking into the image rather than just looking at the surface of the image. So when it comes to big exteriors, one of the things I try and do, and a lot of cinematographers try and do, and photographers, is to darken the foreground down in order to basically bring the light in from more side angles to create more what we call modeling, to create more three dimensions on the subjects. And then also to darken the foreground, it allows the viewer to sort of look into the image more, look deeper into the image. So if we look at these images again with that in mind, you'll notice that the foregrounds, if you look at this woman's face here, you'll notice there's sort of this shape on the face here. And that's by virtue of having a dark foreground. So if you don't have a big budget, you don't have lots of big lights, when you're shooting exteriors, it's actually more important to be thinking about taking light away rather than adding light. And then so, as you can see, again, the modeling on the face there shows the character of the face quite quickly, and it's very dark foregrounds. And that's true of the wider shots as well. So how do we go about that? Well, basically, you have to be a little bit kind of like creative sometimes of how you do this, because as I said earlier, having these big frames, this time with black material on, to what we call negative fill, to kind of darken the foregrounds, can be quite expensive because you need a lot of manpower to hold the frames so they don't blow away in the wind. On this occasion, we had Chinook helicopters as well. And let me tell you, the downdraft of a Chinook helicopter is massive. In fact, at one point, one of the helicopters was docking. It actually blew a shipping container off into the sea. So they have a lot of force. So what we did to create black foregrounds here is we basically stacked up dark shipping containers behind the camera. So I asked them, the thing about, again, about sort of being successful as a cinematographer is to plan ahead, yeah? So the more you can kind of plan ahead, the better you're going to be. Because on the day, I guarantee you, half of the plans that you've made won't be relevant anymore. And you'll be putting out fires in the morning because lots of other stuff would have occurred that you had no idea about previously. So the thing is, always start with some kind of plan in your head, a loose plan of how you're going to attack things, particularly with big exteriors, because one of the things that clients and agency pay for, because I should explain it, that just in case you're unaware, the traditional way the way it works in commercials is you have a client, then you have an agency, and then you have a production company, and then you have the freelance sort of heads of department and crew. So there's a kind of hierarchy, and a client has certain expectations, and they have a product they want to sell, and then you have an agency that come up with a campaign idea or an idea of how to sell that product, and they'll have certain interests and expectations as well. And then what will happen is they'll farm that idea out to different production companies, and then one of the directors at that production company will win that script. And the director will definitely want to please the creatives, because they're like, the creatives are like the director's boss. And I'll want to please the director because they're my boss, and then my crew will want to please me. So there's, like I said earlier, there's a hierarchy to the way things work. And the clients, big clients, they'll have expectations that things should work smoothly. You know, they're paying a lot of money and they don't want to turn up on set regardless of the weather conditions. You know, if it's pouring with rain or if it's sunny, they have a certain kind of idea of what they want, and they have a storyboard that the agency has presented to them, and they sold them that storyboard. So in a sense, that storyboard becomes like a contract between the client and the agency, and then what will happen is the director will look at that storyboard and they'll interpret that themselves, and there'll be a second storyboard, which is the director's boards, and that'll be like a contract between the director and the agency. So you can see how it all kind of works. So you kind of slot into this sort of hierarchical kind of, you know, thing, and you basically have not just creating good photography as one of your priorities, but also you have, you know, not pissing off the client or the agency or the director, or, you know, you've got to try and cover yourself as best you can, you know. So I'm here, you know, back in this port on the south coast of England, trying to make it look like, you know, the Middle East, and we're trying to create photography that's, as I say, has got some integrity to it. And then we're thinking, well, we don't have the manpower to have these big blacks up, so what we'll do is we'll use these containers, and that's the way we'll create shape, you know. So that's kind of how it works in this situation. Now, if I move forward now, so now now we're in Colombia. So this is a campaign we did for Pills and Beer in Colombia. And the idea was to kind of try and make the workers of Colombia come across as being heroic. So we traveled around different parts of Colombia. It was a really wonderful job, actually. I loved working out there. And what we wanted to do is we wanted to kind of give them a sort of painterly quality. And to, you know, my idea was to try and, you know, approach it like it was, you know, a rich aristocrat paying for a portrait, you know. So we're kind of referencing, you know, sort of Renaissance painting, and we wanted to give these guys some real kind of like stature and some kind of you know, to make them, like I say, look as heroic as possible. And for that, again, as you'll see from the images, it was all about darkening the foregrounds and bringing the light in from angles to kind of create this sort of almost like a Rembrandt kind of quality on the face, where there's texture and there's areas of shadow. So you'll see that we carried on that look through the different locations. Now we were traveling all around Colombia, so we never knew what we were going to be approached with. So we're always sort of looking for the correct kind of environment, and then adjusting that environment with the film lights we were using. As you see, there's a quarry there, and we go on the building site. We're down in the, this is down with the miners, and then again back to a container yard, and then we ended up in the fields. And you can see it's all got a kind of similar look to it. It's all got this kind of, oops, is this working? That's it. It's a similar lighting approach. So what that does is, by having a similar lighting approach, it kind of brings a homogeny to all of the images, and it sort of sits them all together. And that's very important in cinematography. Like, what happens with photography, really, you can argue that if you get one great image, then you've succeeded. You know, you have a strong image. But with cinematography, it's a sequence of images that you're interested in. You're telling a story fundamentally, and you want to keep your audience in the story. So the way you keep them in the story is by having a consistency of the imagery. So they're not getting distracted by something that feels out of place. So there's a certain flow to cinematography that's really important. Now that flow basically, as I say, can create the need for a lot of equipment, because you don't know, you're working, what you're trying to do as a director of photography is you're trying to limit your variables. So what you're saying to yourself is, I know certain things are going to change, but when those changes occur, how can I smooth them out the best? So particularly when you're working, and I'm starting my talk with day exteriors, because day exteriors are the hardest, in my opinion, some of the hardest things to get right, because you've got the changing weather conditions, and it's easy to shoot a day exterior that just looks like a day exterior, but when you're trying to create this shape and this three-dimensional modeling that I was talking about, then you've got to start working with quite big materials to try and get that to work. So it can be deceptively difficult to do. And sometimes it can take a little bit of planning, as I say, and a little bit of experience to know how to kind of get away with things and how to do things in an affordable way. So let's move on to the next one now. So this is another, as you can see, got some film lights here. So this is when I started taking behind the scenes shots, which I really wish I'd done on some of my earlier work, because it was, back then it was way more dramatic, because you had these big cranes and all this stuff going on. It looks really spectacular, but alas, back then it was film cameras, and we weren't taking as many shots as people do now. So anyway, this is a Barber commercial, and this was shot in London, and it was shot during the summer in London. So we had to get a snow effects team in to snow down all of the foliage, and we ended up doing a bit of post work to put snow on the roof of the building. And now what I've got there is I've got these two big lights. Now, I don't know how familiar you guys are with lighting, but these are HMI lights, and they're daylight balanced, which basically means they produce a blue light that's very similar to daylight. And they're very powerful lights. These are 18,000 watt lights. And it takes 3 people to mount one of these lights. So you have 2 guys holding the actual head and 1 guy holding the stand, and you yank the stand up and then you've got a light. And then those lights require a lot of power as well. So you have like these big generators that power the lights. Now, as I say, when you have these clients and particularly when you have tight schedules, there's no break in the schedule. So what you've got to do, one of the things a cinematographer does, is they plan out the day based on how the arc of the light's going to work. So you sort of work out your sun path, basically, where the sun's going to be in certain points of the day. And then you plot out how you're going to shoot. Now, what most cinematographers or directors of photography do is they usually have the sun as a backlight or a side light. Traditionally, front lighting can look very flat. And the only time in cinematography where front light looks good is when you shoot beauty, and we'll come on to that later. But so most of the time you're interested in, when you recce a location, when you're deciding on where you're going to shoot, what we tend to do is we tend to want the sun in front of us or to the side of us, but not behind us. So what I do is I plot out the path of the sun, and I try and get in quite early on the recce as well. Sometimes you have a thing called director's recces, where the director will go and look at locations, and I'm not always invited to those. So what I try and insist to go along, or at least I say to them, send me pictures, so I can make a decision quite early on and eliminate locations that they haven't really thought about the lighting, yet the lighting will become a problem, you see. So I'm always trying to ask them to face the right direction, to have the sun in front of them or to either side of them, and then we can work with that, we can build it from there. And then what I've done on this occasion is I've had the lights placed, because that day the sun was coming in and out all day, so that's, in some senses, that's the worst conditions to have, because as I say, you're trying to smooth things out, so you're going from extreme soft light to extreme hard light, and that can be quite challenging. So what I tend to do is I tend to place the lights where the sun's going to break. So if the sun's out, we use the sun, and if the sun's in, we use the lights, and that way you kind of cover yourself. So that's what we did on this occasion, and I'll show you some more slides. So that's our little girl there in the film set, having some fun with the snow effects, and then these are the finished shots. So again, just a shot on anamorphic. This time, this was actually shot digitally, shot on an Alexa Mini. And we were chasing the light at night as well. We were having to do a thing where we went from daylight to dusk, and we had quite a few scenes to do in dusk and at night, and that presents another challenge. So what we've got here in the background, as you'll see, these lights here, these are soft lights that I use quite a lot. And they have these like egg crates on them that basically produce like a more controllable light. And what I do with these is as the ambient light level drops, I waste them into the sky. So basically, what happens when you're shooting around twilight? Everything's changing so quickly. It's a really iridescent time of the day. So you have to kind of move your lights quite quickly to match everything. Otherwise, it starts to look too lit. So you need to, again, plan ahead and think, well, what lights would be good for that, and how can I move those lights quickly? Traditionally, to do a soft light like that, we would use a hard light and then bounce that hard light into something and then put that through a frame. That's referred to as a book light or a wedge. And when we used to work on set, we used to do them all the time. The problem is nowadays people don't have time to build those or to move them around because they're quite, you've got lots of lighting stands and they're quite, clumsy things to move around. So now what the manufacturers have been doing is been finding ways of creating more efficient lights that can be used with less power and that can be used quicker. Because all modern production requires a lot more to be shot a lot quicker. So let's move on. So now you can see we're into the night time now, and you can see that we're using a variety of different things here. There's one of these big lights here again, and we've got some silver bounces. And I'll come on to this a bit later as well. Bouncing light or reflecting light is a really big part of cinematography, and it's something that really needs to be understood. We'll be coming back to that. So let's carry on here. So these are some of the shots of the nighttime sequence, and that's the product there, the Barber jacket. And you can't actually see, I can see it on this monitor here, you can't actually see it here, but there's actually the Barber check is in there. And so one thing the client was really concerned about is making sure that the Barber check could be seen, their brand. They want to see their brand, right? So we're trying to create this shape here of making it look like nighttime, but at the same time, we have the client saying to us, well, you have to see the product, right? So you have to sort of, as a filmmaker, you have to sort of find a way of balancing it and getting it so it looks believable, but then everything that needs to be seen is seen.